Well, we're continuing with our commentary on Mark, session 47. And today we're going to focus, I think, maybe almost exclusively on Jeremiah 7. Of course, in the temple act in Mark, uh, Mark has Jesus say that he was teaching them a very Markan thing, Jesus teaching, taught them many things in the multiplication of the bread in the desert, teaching with exousia, unlike the scribes. And the teaching is described as, in chapter 1, as commanding demons and they obey him. So it doesn't really say what he was teaching. It just says that his didache, which I think is something that can translate Torah, priestly teaching. That's what Torah really is. Later translated law, that in Aramaic, and in nomos in Greek, and we call it the law and the prophets. But Torah and Torot, plural, are priestly instructions regarding pure and impure, etc. And so we already discussed as much as we sort of could Isaiah 56, which I will repeat that Isaiah 56 is the beginning of 3rd Isaiah, which ends with Isaiah 66, bookends. There's a lot of repetition in 66 from chapter 1 of Isaiah. So some editor has added or made parallels in new moon Sabbaths, fire, and all kinds of other things. But what we're most concerned with between 56 and 66 of Isaiah is this inclusiveness. 56 talks about eunuchs and foreigners being admitted, and 66, as we said, opens up the priesthood to people that have never heard of Yahweh. To be a priest in Israel, you needed to have a very strict genealogy. Now, my professor Blenkingsop, who is an expert in Isaiah, and especially Isaiah 56 through 66, and I took his course at the Biblicum, he says that many of these genealogies and chronicles regarding the priesthood are sort of contrived to justify, the lineage of the returnees, etc. We're not going to get into that. But I do remember what he says about Isaiah 66, where it says that I will put a sign and send them, some of the escapees, to the nations, to Tarshish and all these very ancient places, to the remote islands that never heard my fame. I imagine this is probably name in Hebrew, nor seen my glory, and they will announce my glory to the nations. That's verse 19 of chapter 66 of Isaiah. If you skip verse 20, you'll go right into, and also from among them I will take for priests and Levites, says Yahweh. That makes no sense unless it's a novelty that from nations that have never heard of Yahweh, he's going to take for priests and Levites. If it's simply announcing the status quo that to be a priest and Levite, you better prove your lineage, that really makes no sense. So what Professor Blenkingsop famously said was that verse 20, and they will bring your brethren, carry them like mules, etc., sort of doing the heavy labor. It sort of interprets this whole thing as that the role of the nations will be as porters, just like they do the heavy lifting in chapter 60 and 61, 62. So Blenkingsop said a nervous editor inserted verse 20 to really water down the import of the whole thing. But that having been said, the second teaching that Jesus gives is that the famous one, you have made it a den of robbers, says the English Standard. I think cave would be more literal and accurate. Maybe it doesn't sound as good. And of course, I guess the King James canonized den of thieves. But it's really a cave of Lestai, who were violent robbers, and it is the expression used by Josephus for the revolutionaries who rose against the Roman Empire, and that he despises as very violent. So he dismisses them by calling them, common violent criminals. So it's important to look at this, and I hope we can finish with Jeremiah today, because the rate I'm going, we're taking the scenic route, which I think is fine with me. So they crucified Jesus in Mark. Very interesting. Between two lestai, two of these violent people. And I'm looking for it here. And oftentimes in my old age, I have trouble finding things. But they crucify him with two highwaymen, says 1527. But if I look at it in the Greek, 1527 is going to say lestas. So two of these very type of insurrectionists, or political criminals, presumably involved in violence, just like Barabbas was. So that we have to then look at Jeremiah 7 to see the background of what is happening in Mark. And Jeremiah 7, as I said, is his inaugural speech against the temple, predicting its destruction, and lambasting the Jews, and especially his opponents, the priests. Remember, Jeremiah is one of the defrocked priests banished to Anathoth by Solomon. And so he's coming from a Levite Deuteronomic school that is opposed to a Sadducite, sort of Aaronid school. And one of the great experts of this was Frank Moore Cross at Harvard, called by Herschel Shanks of Biblical Archaeology Review, a Jew, called the Presbyterian Moore the world's greatest Bible scholar. And of course, he was sort of the successor of William Foxwell Albright in dating, paleographic studies by the handwriting. He was, and I would see him around had I known what it was all about when I was at Harvard Divinity School. I would have taken his courses, but at the time I wasn't into Bible. But I've seen him often enough in TV, and I've read his books and stuff like that. Frank Moore Cross. So these two schools at the time of Jeremiah are not yet compromised or united in a finished 5-book Torah. That'll happen under Persian pressure. So that at the time of Jeremiah, we're going to see that he's going to say that Yahweh never ordered sacrifices in the deserts. Well, what does that do to Leviticus, the central book of the Pentateuch? It's all about sacrifices in the desert. And so you have these two schools, and I think Amos before Jeremiah would also be in that line that your feasts are disgusting to me, etc., in what is going to happen. And here I follow great Israeli scholars like Israel Noel, and going back, I think, basically to Ezekiel Kaufman, but uh, maybe not. And then Richard Elliott Friedman. That's probably the best book I could recommend that you read on the Old Testament. Who wrote the Bible? Richard Elliott Friedman. Tremendous, tremendous book. Disciple of Frank Moore Cross at Harvard. So what you have is a school of prophets, a prophetic type movement that, according to Israeli scholars like Israel Noel, in the 8th century especially, influenced the priestly school, which had been wholly focused on the temple and its sacrifices and its purity, and this kind of metaphysics of purity and impurity that is cleaned with sacrifices without ethics. I have called that an ethic-less cult. I may not have invented that, but I think I came up with that. You have these prophets influencing the priestly school into incorporating a social justice teaching. And the greatest example of that is the book of Leviticus. The first 15 chapters of Leviticus are purely about purity and diet and sacrifices. Chapter 16, the middle, I think, is all about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and they don't know what school that's from. But then 17 through 26, and I think it was an appendix in 27, all that is the holiness school. Be holy as I, Yahweh, your God, am holy. And that's incredibly ethical. That's where you find, unexpectedly in a priestly writing, love your neighbor as yourself, and love the ger, the resident alien, as yourself. And you get all the sexual regulations and all kinds of other ethical regulations. And so you have the prophets influencing the priests. But in Jeremiah, you've got both priests and prophets, or as the Septuagint translates, pseudo prophets, false prophets, attacking Jeremiah precisely because of this speech. And that occurs in the Hebrew text of Jeremiah chapter 26. It is in chapter 33 of the Greek translation, the Septuagint, which has the oracles against the nations, 7 chapters displaced from where the Hebrew has them, or maybe the Hebrew displaced what the Greek did. And so you have Jeremiah on trial with priests and false prophets attacking him. Very reminiscent, I read an article on that, very reminiscent of the false witnesses against Jesus, saying he said he would destroy the temple. So Jeremiah gets taken to trial for this speech in chapter 7. And in fact, his skin is saved by the most, the Zaganim Haaretz, the elders of the land. Remember Micah, about 150 years before, who had said that Jerusalem would be like a plowed field, all destroyed. They didn't kill him. So that Jeremiah is saved by his protectors. He's got very powerful Deuteronomic type protectors, the Shaphan family, and their sons, Gedaliah and Ahikam, I think it is one of them. And so he has protectors of this so-called pro-Babylonian party, and his attackers are the pro-Egyptian party, so-called. They think Egypt is going to help keep out Babylon, and Jeremiah is saying, no, it's not happening. get ready. Babylon is coming. So with that kind of background as to the importance of Jeremiah 7, we want to walk through it as much as our time allows. We have about 5 minutes. And I think I probably said enough already so that I can try to finish. But remember, Jeremiah's priesthood is the one that was linked to Shiloh. And Jeremiah remembers that that venerable sanctuary was destroyed. I want to say just one thing that, and Franklin Moore Cross is very good at this. Um, the Levitical priesthood could trace itself back to Egypt. They had been defrocked by the Sadokites. But the Sadokites, and I think maybe Melchizedek was kind of like a Sadokite type guy. The king of Melchizedek is like a king of Zadok or Zedek or Sedek or some sort of god that is, an embodiment of righteousness or something. But the Sadokites were based in Jerusalem, and nobody really knows where they came from except pagan. Whereas the Levites were, really at least sons of Jacob. They could at least trace themselves back to that. So you have these two schools, and I think they will evolve into Sadducees and Pharisees. Pharisees would be sort of like, their ancestors, maybe once or twice removed, were defrocked priests, and they were studying Torah, but not officiating in the temple. Ezekiel 44 takes care of defrocking these Levites for some abominations they did, which is not too clear what they did. But only the sons of Zadok, the Sadokites, are going to be able to approach the altar. The other guys are helpers, catechists, permanent deacons, glorified altar boys, cantors. In Judaism, you have the rabbis and the cantors. They're both basically ordained and trained, but two different things. In any case, in Jeremiah 7, you've got this diatribe or lambasting of the sacrifices and an emphasis on obedience. What I did do, says Yahweh, was not order you sacrifices, but send my prophets diligently, time after time, telling you to convert and listen to them, or listen to them and convert, and that you didn't do it, but you mistreated them. That's exactly what Jesus is going to do in chapter 12, right after this. The story of Israel, the owner of the vineyard sends his servants. Some they cudgel and beat up and kill. And then the Christian novelty is he ups the ante. In the end, in Eschaton, he sent his beloved son. He doesn't Mashuk crazy. They're mistreating all his servants, and now he sends his son in this naive expectation that they're going to respect him. And of course, they say he's the heir, let's kill him. That's the Christian crazy God. And in the beginning of Hebrews, the same idea is repeated. Now, about to finish. In times past, in various ways, God spoke through the prophets. In these last days, he has spoken to us through a Son, whom he has made heir. That is the Christian kernel of faith. So we're almost done with Jeremiah 7. We'll just take it up next time with some of the details, but it does announce total devastation, very much in line with what is being quoted here that Jesus said. And we'll have to get into these perutzim, these oparitzim, these blood-shedding people. Ezekiel specifically uses it as a bloodshedder, and some other texts speak of this robbers thing. These think not embezzlement, high prices for sacrifices or selling pigeons or something. Think in terms of criminal violence of a serious sort. So this is quite an attack on the temple, and we'll have to take it up next time.